It's the second poetry book of the month on the Ripon pages, and after going stateside with Baron Wormser all the way over in Vermont, we're bringing it home this month with Charlotte Eichler. This is one of my favourites this year, and I'm delighted to be talking about her collection, Swimming Between Islands, published by Carcanet. Indeed, archipelagos, kestrels, jellyfish, rivers animate Charlotte's poems. Anthony Vahni Capildeo has called her a poet of the modern pastoral, while Steve Whitaker in the Yorkshire Times described Charlotte as having a forensic eye and finding energy and industry in a world rendered steroidal by a microscope of the imagination. It's more than a question of what meets the eye in Charlotte's poems, but how the eye helps render the world in the perceiver's own language. Prior to this, Charlotte published a pamphlet with Valley Press called Their Lunar Language. She lives in West Yorkshire. Charlotte, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Liam.
But one of the things that I noticed in this collection, and one of the first things that I noticed, is the use of pronouns of all things. And in particular, how pronouns were often the first word of the poem.
I like to use we in particular in poems as opposed to I, because especially with the poems of childhood, I think there's something kind of sibling-like about a we in a poem, especially a childhood poem. And there's something of that feeling of kind of charging around in a gang with other children or even other teenagers, where you're sort of collectively experiencing the world together. And I like that in a poem where it keeps the point of view kind of looking outwards, and hopefully includes the reader somewhat and brings them into the poem as a we. But I don't know, there's something particularly nice, I think, about when you don't use I in a poem. I think that I can bring you sort of too much into the speaker's head, and it's too interior as opposed to looking outwards at the world.
So did you have siblings?
I've got a brother, who I'm very close to, and I think a lot of my childhood experiences that I write about in the book, kind of not autobiographically, it's a bit more oblique than that. When you're out in nature or running around in the fields with friends, like those are my favorite memories of childhood, and there's a lot less awareness of yourself as an individual, and you're more just sort of looking wide-eyed at things for the first time.
I mean, I had a sister, and I remember I was a little bit older than her, and I kind of remember taking care of her to some extent, looking after them when they're out and about.
Mm-hmm.
Are you trying to create a sibling out of the reader, so to speak? You kind of said you're bringing the reader in with you to this experience, to this vision.
I think what I'm always trying to do in poetry is to recreate, and maybe what everyone is trying to do is to recreate what it's like to have experienced something yourself. And so bringing them into the poem as a sort of way of being closer to the experience and sort of central in that place, rather than that I'm showing it to them, that they're actually, the poem is an experience rather than something they're being told or explained.
Yeah, because I didn't feel like you were, massively personal, but you're not a confessional poet in the it's not kind of all out on the page, is it? But there is something about it that feels experiential, or that even if you're not experiential, you are taking us on that journey with you through these poems. Yeah,
and I think I do use, I wouldn't say it's not confessional particularly, and there's very few poems in there that are factually accurate in terms of being taken from my life or my experiences, but it's absolutely full of very concrete details of things that I've observed or have really happened. And sometimes when I'm writing like that and I'm sort of gathering these details, I'll put them in a poem and think that's a little bit too obscure, like, because it's so specific from something I've seen or done, or even that's come from a dream, maybe, like just a weird little true detail. Somehow that kind of detail can work really well in a poem to sort of trigger associations in the reader. I think I realized this in one of the oldest poems in the book, which is called Survivors, which has got kind of little details about when my brother and I used to visit our great aunts, and we did, like, they had They had a chest full of toy koalas, and they had china cockatoos, and they had and we had like all the details in that poem are true, and even the creating a bee's graveyard. Well, I think when I was writing it, because I was quite a new poet at the time, I thought, well, this is all very well, but what are people actually going to take from these kind of details? But a lot of people have told me that that poem reminds them of their own kind of experiences with older relatives, and so even if the details aren't the same, then it's that concrete thing that brings you in to the poem.
Yeah, I mean, I can see what people might, well, assuming that they mean it's kind of that visit to a different generation. You know, they have these kind of, I don't want to call them relics, but kind of things for that, you know, it felt a little bit outdated in the sense you've got the Viewmaster, the Unchanging Views of Prague, and No TV. And I think it is there in some sense, but I don't, you know, it felt like this was one of the sort of few poems that there is a kind of darker, well, it's apparent that this is obviously is, but there's a pain attached to this poem.
Yeah.
A history of pain to some extent.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm not saying it's not a dark poem. It's about Holocaust survivors, but and I think to me, loads of the poems that are from childhood do have that darker edge, because I think childhood is a lot darker than we than traditionally we might hope for it to be.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I really like exploring that side of things. And like, I mean, I'm talking a lot about childhood, but I don't feel like I'm that different a person from that child who's experiencing the world. And I kind of like to bring out those darker things and have them side by side with the light.
Do you think this kind of childhood then, do you think the kind of childhood in the natural world, or when you were thinking about writing these poems, do you think that exposure to the natural world gave you a more of a predisposition to the fact that there is, you know, a darker truth to the world, that there is sort of a light and a darkness?
Maybe. I mean, I had a fairly rural childhood. I grew up in a village, hence there are a lot of poems about running around in fields and being in the garden. And it was the 80s when I was growing up, so we were allowed to just go out and be out all day, and no parents were looking after us. So I suppose that does give you sort of more of an experience to work things out and to fall out with each other and to discover horrible things in the woods. And come across dead animals, and I don't know really, maybe it did. I don't really associate that feeling of being in nature with you know, nature red in tooth and claw and full of danger.
I don't think it's danger. It's not danger. It's like I said, it's just, you know, like I said, things, you know, dead animals and that kind of thing. The natural world is full of life. It's full of death. It's full of it's full of life. It's got to be full of death, I think, I guess.
Well, I think even now I'm like very, very focused when I'm out and about on what's around me in terms of the environment and the animals and the birds. I go for walks every day. I'm a bit of a bird watcher, gathering details about the world when I'm out and about. Like, most of my poems are sparked from being especially in new places in nature, and that is where my poems come from. It's rather than sort of sitting at home and kind of, yeah, I don't, well, maybe everyone's poems start like this, but it's definitely like a concrete gathering of detail and image that my poems begin from, rather than more of an interior kind of emotion or interior impulse. And they usually go in that direction. They'll become sort of more interior and intellectual as I'm writing them, but the gathering of images comes from that being in nature and wanting to feel part of nature.
Yeah, the key thing that you seem to say there, the thing that struck me is that they start by you being out in the world. And that's where it starts. It doesn't start from the desk, so to speak, or it doesn't seem like it starts from the desk. It's about you being out in the world. And that's the thing about the kind of pronouns and the use of, you know, the sense of perspective. You are bringing us on this journey with you in some respects. You are taking us with you, and that's why the ideas of siblings I thought was quite interesting, because it feels like don't want to say there's an arm around us, so to speak, as the reader, but it's yeah, you're taking us with us into this world and the worlds that you create, because it's very visual, there's a lot of metaphor, and I guess metaphor is a way of making people relate to the world as well. But either way, perspectives does seem important in your poems, or creating perspective. But saying that as well, but you kind of do some tricks with us, or it feels like you do some tricks. You invert the world sometimes. It feels like you're sort of playing with illusions quite a lot. I wonder if this was then a comment about your connection, or perhaps our connection, ours as in human beings, connection with the world.
Well, my favourite poems are poems that that you feel, well, they're like sort of places that you can revisit, and as I've said, sort of that you can experience a poem as you're going around it. And I think what I'm trying to do when I write is to recreate that experience that I have of sort of being in the world and of thinking, sort of basically what does it feel like to be a person in the world and touched by the things that you're going about your day doing. And like the process of thought and thinking and being a person is just never, it's not linear, it's not a linear narrative. And that's what poems can do really well, is have these different perspectives that sort of jump around but still work as a whole. And similarly, in the place that you're in, your eyes will be up in the top of the trees. You'll be, if you're at the sea, your mind will actually be at the bottom of the sea wondering what's down there. And I think that kind of inversion, and almost like, I haven't really thought about it much, but I didn't think about it as inversion in the way that you described it, but you're right, there is that sort of swapping of land and sea, or sky and sea in Asteroidia, one of the poems.
What would you call it? What would you call it?
I was thinking of sort of swapping substances, like the transposition of different substances. So like in the 50-year traffic jam, the cars are sort of gradually becoming, sort of swapping themselves with the trees and vice versa. And Fata Morgana is about the mirage that you get when you're out at the sea, where it looks like you can see kind of castles and boats kind of floating on the sea, because the light's bending in some scientific way that I can't really describe, but it's that sort of like the light and the water and the land is getting all mixed up together. And I did see one of those mirages when I was on the boat on the way to the Lofoten Islands. But when I got to the Lofoten Islands, being on those islands, because there was so much water around and the houses were kind of higgledy-piggledy dotted around the island in geographically just in the places that they could be built, it felt like a really dynamic environment where the water could overwhelm everything at any moment. So I was using that mirage to sort of describe the actual place. It's an attempt to describe what the experience of thought and feeling is when you're in a landscape, and thinking is a bit more like swimming. You're not just like plodding along from one point to the next in your mind.
I mean, you can Google Fata Morgana and you can sort of see it, and you can kind of Google it and you get a photo of it, and then you can read the Wikipedia entry on it, or you can even go onto Google Scholar and read the academic description. But your poem also describes it in a different way, and perhaps in a, I don't know what's the right way, the wrong way, the better way, but either way, it's trying to describe an experience.
Yeah, you need both, don't you? You need the facts and the science to understand it, but you also need to be able to understand it from a human experiential point of view. To be honest, I wouldn't have noticed it myself if the person on the boat hadn't pointed it out, but they just, like, it was very far on the horizon, and there's sort of a gap between the water and the clouds. Like, I didn't see a boat floating or an island floating. I just could see like it was a little bit weird and shimmery, but they said that's a Fata Morgana, and so supposedly that's where myths about floating islands and floating ships come from, because had it been just over the horizon, a piece of land, then that sort of the light would have bent it so the land looked like it was floating above the water.
Are you sort of much traveled in that area? Seems like you are.
Not really. There was just this one particularly good holiday I had a long time ago with my family, and it was 10 days. We went around the Scottish Islands and up the Norwegian coast, and ended up at the Lofoten Islands. We were just sort of stopping off as we went along. It was
lots of islands.
sort of a once in a lifetime kind of holiday, and it's actually where I started writing poetry because I wanted to record what I was seeing, and it felt like a good subject for poems, so I just started experimenting.
Definitely, yeah. Well, it is, the title of the collection is Swimming Between Islands, but they are very, they are strong for metaphors, aren't they? A lot of metaphorical potential in an island. Hello, thanks once again for joining me on today's episode of the Rippling Pages. Now, if you're in Bradford on the 4th of November, I'm going to be talking to Tom Branford about his new collection, Bore, which has just been published by Broken Sleep. There's a link to the tickets in the show notes. Hope to see you there. What it appeals to you? I mean, it's now you've written this collection about islands. Do you think you'll write about them again? I mean, how powerful are they for you?
Well, the reason I ended up with a lot of poems about islands in the first place was because not especially on a poetic level, but just on a personal level, I really like visiting that kind of place. I like being basically as isolated as possible and as far away from other people as possible.
Right,
I like cold northern places. I'm more of a cold weather person than a hot weather person. I don't know, it's just sort of an intensifying of like stories set on islands are really fascinating because they can just be so intense and focused, and I think that just really lends itself to writing a poem. Because one of the weird things I noticed when I was putting the book together was that the poems I've written set in Russia are much longer. The lines are longer. The poems are just like, they're some of my longest poems, like At the Cathedral of the Spilled Blood, and they're much more long and sprawling, whereas the island poems are short and contained and surrounded by the sea of the page, if I can choosily put it like that. But it wasn't intentional, but I think there was something about when I was writing about Russia that was just much more expansive, and I think the landscape was informing that.
Yeah, 52 Sovetskaya Prospects.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I didn't notice that. But if you look at compared to something like Into the Fjords, for instance.
Yeah, fragmented and
yes.
Because the fjords are a very fragmented sort of landscape. I think that's what the poem's doing.
It's an enduring theme, isn't it? But is there something in for you about the kind of mythical element? Is there a mythical capacity of an island?
I've got a background in Old Norse studies, so I've always, since before I started writing poetry, I've been interested in Old Norse myth and Icelandic literature, and so for me that kind of northern myth is very much entangled with islands, like the Vikings being on the Scottish Islands and Iceland, and then the fjords of Norway, and that kind of landscape. So, and some of the poems are inspired by, like, more directly by Norse myth, like Hervor and Volund and Valkyrie to some extent, I guess. There's a sort of fairy tale starkness to that kind of landscape with the pine trees and the snow, and that works really well with a myth or a fairy tale. I think just the simplicity of the story that is then really fertile ground for writing poetry that's inspired by that, whether directly or indirectly.
One of the things that I saw quite a lot of is there's lots of images of wings. So there are images of birds, but also more specifically, and in Valkyrie, it felt sort of fairy tale like for all those different things that word can mean. Is there anything related to what you just said?
I think partly that I love birds, and I particularly like watching birds in the UK. There's something kind of hidden and cryptic about attempting to see birds in this country, because they're often so small and brown and you just don't see them very easily, and I think that makes them more mysterious and fascinating in a way, and makes you want to sort of chase after them and try and see them more. I think maybe if I'd grown up in a landscape like more tropical and there were these incredible winged creatures of rainbow hues in front of me all the time, that might not be something that I'd write poetry about, because there'd be no mystery to it. Like, it'd be beautiful, it would be sort of the poem already there in front of you, it wouldn't need writing. Whereas there's something about, I think, UK nature and maybe the hardness of the kind of landscapes that our animals live in, like it's cold and frosty, and they're sort of struggling to survive amongst all this humanity. There's something about that just makes me want to somehow try and pin it down
Yeah, is it the mystery of it what appeals to you? What draws you in?
I think it is. I think I could probably illustrate what I mean by this example. So in Leeds, are you familiar with Tropical World in Roundhay Park?
Indeed, many a school trip.
It's Yeah, well, they've got this nocturnal section, and they've got an awesome collection of fruit bats. And when I first used to go, because we used to live in Roundhay, we would go, and the bats were so badly lit that you could barely see them. They were just sort of outlines, and you'd occasionally see one sort of flutter towards the glass to sit on a banana and chew it, but you couldn't really see them at all. And like I just stood there for ages trying to see the bats, trying to work out what was going on. And then later on they started lighting the nocturnal section with red lights, which obviously didn't disturb the animals, but it meant that we could see them better. And then the bats lost a lot of their appeal for me. They just weren't
Wow. Okay.
experience. I'm not slagging up the bats, there were still great bats. There was nothing, I guess, for the imagination to do. And I like writing, and I like poems, especially where there's something for the reader to do. Like it's not all there in front of them. There's a bit of a mystery to solve, or not to solve, but just to experience, and to make you want to come back.
That's a really nice answer. And I like that we sort of came from sort of not really knowing to the answer is that we don't know. But I like that idea. I like that the fact that it is the mystery of, the mystery appeals to you. And the mystery is, it's enjoy. It brings people back, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What's that kind of feeling like then when you sort of are told about that? Does it kind of break the mystery down a bit, or does it kind of make you go, oh, wow, or,
You can't be intentional when you're too intentional when you're writing poems, because if you have a plan and decide, right, I want to write about this, then it's often going to fall flat on the page. But I think being aware of the kind of imagery that you're putting in there is good. It's like, even to the point of, feeling like maybe you're repeating yourself and you should probably push yourself in a new direction. I probably shouldn't write another book that's quite so full of eggs and wings and islands, otherwise I'm just jumping up and down on the same spot.
Maybe, I don't know. Maybe, I guess, but it's. I guess it is. I guess I'm sort of asking you about craft art, really. What would happen if you started to sit down and write? Is it about something that's more unconscious than it is conscious, or do you feel in control of this to some extent? Do you need to feel in control of this when you're writing a poem, of these motifs and images?
I think when you're first writing a poem, when I'm first writing a poem, I need to be not in control of it at all. I think otherwise you're not gonna get to the interesting places. I think you need to. I think I need to, like I said, be out in a place and see what is coming to me from outside. But then when these poems have gone through so many drafts, you need that sense of editorial control afterwards, without trying to, you don't want to lose the kernel of what it was about in the first place.
There's a couple of lines that stood out to me. Slimy intimacy from a meditation on small frogs. We live life close to the ground, which is from Goblin Core. And that last one in particular has stayed in my mind ever since I heard you read it. Genuinely, it sort of trills in my mind from time to time. And it just seemed to say so much about a connection with the world. But also this idea of a slimy intimacy. And so a lot of your poems are about the connection with the world, one way or another. But this one in particular, it made me think about, even though it's a poem about frogs, as we said, it makes me think about our connection with people too.
Yeah, it did. That was one of those, like, there's always been something about animals that makes me want to properly interact with them, like properly to the extent that I annoy them and scare them. But I want to stroke every cat and horse and pick up the frogs, even slugs. Just, I don't know, just for that connection for some reason. And just that poem started off from a literal, these frogs are cool, I want to play with these frogs. And then I think it did become about, I think quite obviously about our intimacy with people, and getting close to people, I think loads of this book is about trying to find the balance between being close to people, holding on to them, and needing that kind of freedom, independence for yourself. There's a lot of kind of ambivalence about domesticity in the book, in terms of being a wife and a mother kind of a thing. Like, not, I don't talk about that particularly overtly, and I'm not a mother, but that sort of deciding whether to settle down or whether to be free and able to sort of roam around and harass frogs whenever you like. I come from a very close nuclear family, and my parents are still together, and we're all very close. But it's about making that move from being part of that family to kind of creating your own family, like being your own person, and letting go of that position in that family, or your position sort of as a child and a daughter, as opposed to an adult. I think that's there kind of subtly in this poem, in the let them go, long towing back to the stream, tiny gold rings in their eyes. Like, gold rings appear a lot in Norse mythology, as symbols of being tied to other people, and there's obviously rings of marriage.
I feel like there was, it started as a poem's progressed, started to feel like there was something here about sort of what are gender roles within sort of society. It wasn't overtly political, but it did start to feel like this was emerging as a theme here. There's a commentary being made about roles.
Yeah, that's definitely a strong theme in the book. That it's not something I set out to put into the book, but it's just reflecting my experience of the world and how I am. And I'm not overtly political person. Like, obviously everyone is political, but I don't sort of I feel like I don't have the vocabulary to just say, right, really loudly, like, this is a feminist poem about gender roles and things. But I think it just creeps into my poems in a more subtle way, and it's definitely there. Yeah.
But yeah, also, the kind of, again, just sort of finding things in the world, how we sort of map our experience. And I guess that is a question, is it, about how we map? A lot of it, like you said, you're sort of finding and chasing the frogs, and you kind of wanted to connect to them. And it feels like the line you use is about mapping out the countries in the babies and the darlings. And it feels like you are trying to find ways to map out the world, or the poems about people mapping out ways. And we start to do that, don't we, as children, I guess. But yeah, sometimes the map is not drawn by us, is it? I guess, as much as we'd like it to be.
And I think these forces of the gender roles and patriarchy are just there in the background, acting on us in much more subtle ways than we're usually aware of, and that can be a really powerful force behind whatever work somebody's doing. Without it, it's sort of bleeding in there, really, I think, in my poems, rather, because it is a force in the background that I'm not overly aware of, but that definitely is there.
Yeah, well, it's your poems do speak about they speak about the natural world, but they speak about ourselves as humans, don't they, in the natural world? And I don't know, do you feel like we're losing some of that connection at all?
Oh yeah, for sure, myself included. I think what I'm trying to do when I'm writing is maintain for myself that kind of connection. Like, it's a practice of paying attention and looking and being connected to a place in time, as opposed to having half of my brain on the internet or in virtual spaces, or worrying about work and other commitments. We've all got to do that, but I think the internet and social media and phones obviously have a lot to answer for, in terms of making us feel disconnected with not with the natural world and the environment and that kind of thing, but just literally as human animals. Like, I think it's really bad for our mental health to not be present with the people that we're with and in the place that we're in. I think it makes I find myself, if I spend too much time on my phone or the internet, or just generally sort of mentally in that kind of virtual space, the real world loses its color and its draw. It becomes less interesting than the kind of addictive, flashing, brightly colored things that I can find on an electronic device. Everyone deals with it differently, and maybe just for me it's particularly I'm particularly sensitive to it, but I don't know, I just see a lot of people who are not paying any attention to where they are, and I think in my writing for myself and hopefully for people who are reading the poems, it's sort of trying to ask people to look more closely at these things that are.
Well, Charlotte, you do invoke us to look closer, and Swimming Between Islands. It's published by Carcanet. It's out now, and it's got a lovely cover that I think is painted by you, Charlotte.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's a digital watercolor that I did on my iPad. It was a lockdown skill that I learned.
All right.
Had to do iPad painting.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Well, don't only buy the book. You're not only getting Charlotte's poems, but you are getting her own artwork. Charlotte, thank you very much for joining me on the Ripping Pages podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really lovely to chat.
Thanks once again to Charlotte for joining me on today's episode of the Ripping Pages. But of course, my biggest thanks to you for listening as well. Join me next time when I'll be with returning guest